The old, yellowed envelope lay on the kitchen table, untouched for days. No one in the family had the courage to open it. The return address was unmistakable: Clint Eastwood. Mary's trembling hands brushed over her late mother's name, handwritten in bold black ink. 40 years. 40 years of silence. And now, this. The room held its breath as Mary tore the envelope open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, aged but intact. And as she read the first line, her knees buckled. "I owe you an answer. I should have written back sooner." Margaret Reynolds was 28 years old when she wrote to Clint Eastwood. She was no crazed fan, no starstruck dreamer. She was a mother, a broken one. Her letter wasn't about admiration, but regret. In her youth, Margaret had made a terrible mistake, a mistake that haunted her every waking moment. She had been pregnant at 18, unwed, and terrified. With no support and no means to survive, she had made the heartbreaking decision to give up her baby for adoption. Years later, she learned something that shattered her. Her baby had been adopted by a family connected to Clint Eastwood. Whether distant relatives or close friends, she didn't know. All she knew was that somehow her child had grown up in a world that Eastwood himself might have touched. So she wrote. She poured her soul into that letter, begging for any information, a whisper, a clue, something that could tell her whether her son had lived a good life. She sealed it with hope, mailed it to Eastwood's office, and waited. And waited. But no answer ever came. As the years passed, the pain settled like a stone in her chest. She tried to move on. She built a family, had more children, and lived the best life she could. Yet every night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was safe, if he was loved, and why Clint Eastwood never wrote back. Decades passed, and Margaret grew old. The letter became a memory, buried deep beneath life's responsibilities. Until one day, something unimaginable happened. A young man, tall and rugged, walked into a bookstore where Margaret's daughter Mary worked. His voice was warm, his presence familiar in an eerie way. They struck up a conversation, and as they spoke about books, movies, and life, he mentioned something that made Mary's heart stop. "My dad used to tell me that I was connected to Clint Eastwood in some weird way." The world around her blurred. She gripped the counter, her heart pounding. It couldn't be. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "James," he said with a smile. "James Callahan." Mary excused herself and ran to the back room, gasping for breath. Callahan. That was the name on the adoption papers her mother had hidden for years. Could it be? After all this time? She went home that night and told her mother. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to believe it. Not without proof. And so, with nothing but a desperate heart and an old memory, Mary did what her mother had done 40 years earlier. She wrote to Clint Eastwood. Unlike her mother's letter, Mary's did not go unanswered. Weeks later, a response came. Not from an assistant, not from a secretary, but from Clint Eastwood himself. His letter was brief but powerful. He apologized for the silence, explaining that in the chaos of Hollywood, some things slipped through the cracks. But then he dropped a bombshell. He knew. For years he had heard whispers about an old letter, a plea from a mother. He had never read it himself, but when Mary's letter arrived, something clicked. He remembered James, and so he did what he should have done decades ago. He wrote back. He confirmed the truth. James Callahan was, indeed, Margaret's lost son, raised well, educated, and deeply loved. And now he would finally know where he came from. Margaret met James in the spring. It was quiet, simple, yet earth-shattering. James, now a grown man with children of his own, embraced the mother he never knew. They cried, laughed, and grieved the lost years. But most of all, they healed. The reunion wasn't just about them. It rippled through their entire family. Mary gained a brother. James's children gained a grandmother. And Margaret? She finally found peace. One letter, one simple act, and it changed everything. As Margaret sat on her porch one evening, holding James's hand, she looked down at the letter from Clint Eastwood. A letter 40 years in the making. Her heart felt lighter than it had in decades. And then she noticed something at the bottom of the letter. A second note, handwritten, separate from the rest. It read, "I never got the chance to answer you before, but sometimes life has a way of bringing the right people together at the right time. I'm glad you finally found your son, Clint." Margaret smiled through her tears. She had waited a lifetime for an answer, and now she finally had it.